Booktube, a review about the book entitled Conscious, a brief guide to the fundamental mystery of the mind by Annaka Harris.
What is consciousness? How do we define it? How can we say we have it? And many more things we will try to answer as we go further and deep dive to the human mind. About the author. Who is Annaka Harris? Annaka Harris is an American author. Her work touches on neuroscience, meditation, philosophy of mind, and consciousness. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Conscious, a brief guide to the fundamental mystery of the mind, and the children's book, I Wonder. How do we define consciousness? People who use word in a variety of ways. For example, in referring to a state of wakefulness, a sense of selfhood, or the capacity for self-reflection. But when we want to single out the mysterious quality of the heart of consciousness, it's important to narrow in on what makes it unique.
Intuition and illusion. In this chapter, the author gave the following questions. Number 1. In a system we know has conscious experiences, the human brain, what evidence of consciousness can we detect from the outside? Number 2. Is consciousness essential to our behavior? This also explains and talks about our intuition, or some called as guts. For example, we have the ability to unconsciously perceive elements in our environment, in the threatening situations that in turn deliver an almost instantaneous assessment of danger, such as an intuition that we shouldn't get into an elevator with someone, even though we can't put our finger on why. Many of our Filipino friends call this in Tagalog, hinala or pakiramdam. Consider first that it's possible for conscious experience to exist without any outward expression at all, at least in your brain. To give a striking example of this is the neurological condition called locked-in syndrome, in which virtually one's entire body is paralyzed, but consciousness is fully intact. According to her, this condition was made famous by Jean-Dominique Bauby, the late editor-in-chief of French Elle, who ingeniously devised a way to write about his personal story of being locked in. After a stroke left him paralyzed, Bauby retained only the ability to blink his left eye. Amazingly, his caretakers noticed his efforts to communicate, and over time they developed a method whereby he could spell out words through a pattern of blinks, thus revealing the full scope of his conscious life. He described his harrowing experience in his 1997 memoir, and I quote, The Divining Bell and the Butterfly, which he wrote in about 200,000 blinks. Of course, we may assume that his consciousness would not have been changed whatsoever if his left eyelid had succumbed to the paralysis as well. And without his mobility, there would have been absolutely no way for him to communicate. He was fully conscious.
Daniel Chavomits. What a plant knows. A field guide to the senses describes how stimulations of a plant can cause reactions similar to those in animals under analogous conditions. Some behaviors of people and plants are so alike that this in fact poses a challenge to our using certain behavior as evidence of conscious experience. The stimulations of a plant cell can cause cellular changes that result in an electrical signal, similar to the reaction caused by nerve cells in animals. He also describes some of the shared mechanisms between plants and animals down to the level of DNA. Analogous mechanisms exist in plants for detecting sounds, scents, and locations, and even for forming memories. In an interview with Scientific American, Chavomits describes how different types of memory play a role in plant behavior. Ecologist Suzanne Simard's research in forest ecology has produced breakthrough in our understanding of intertree communications. Equally surprising were the result of further research led by Simard, showing that Douglas fir mother trees were able to distinguish between their own kin and neighboring strangers, seedlings. Simard mother trees colonized their kin with bigger mycorrhizal networks, sending them more carbon below ground, Simard by spreading toxins through underground fungal networks. Plants are also able to fight off threatening species.
Consciousness free. We tend to experience a continuous stream of events in our lives, but we also become aware of them slightly after they have happened. This is because our brains are constantly processing different sensory information. For example, the light and sound waves released when the tennis ball makes contact with your racket do not reach your eyes and ears at the same time, and the impact felt by your hand holding the racket occurs at a different time. To make matters even more complicated, the impulses received by your hands, eyes, and ears travel varying distances via your neurological system before arriving at your brain. Your hands are a lot farther away from your brain than your ears are. Only until the brain has received all essential data do the signals get synchronized and enter your conscious experience through a process known as binding, in which you see, hear, and feel the ball strike the racket all at once. A series of such studies were conducted by the psychologists Daniel Wenner and Talia Wedley. So what function does consciousness play if it isn't the one who creates the desire to move, but rather the one who observes the action while pretending to be involved? We can see how the sensation of free will, as we usually perceive it, is not as simple as it appears. And if we can debunk this popular belief, we may start to doubt the assumption that consciousness is crucial in guiding human conduct. It's important to mention that when I allude to the nature of free will in this context, I'm talking about the sensation of having a conscious will. I'm referring to the basic, everyday delusion that we all appear to have, that we are different and independent selves, separate not just from others and the outer world, but also from our own bodies, as if our conscious experience somehow floats free of the material world.
It's important to clarify that when I talk about the nature of free will in this context, I'm referring specifically to the feeling of a conscious will. I'm pointing to the fundamental, day-to-day illusion we all seem to walk around with, that we are distinct and separate selves, separates not only from those around us and from the outside world, but even from our own bodies. As if our conscious experience somehow floats free of the material world, the brain as a system does have a type of free will. However, in that, it makes decisions and choices on the basis of outside information, internal goals, and complex reasoning. But when I discuss the illusion of conscious will here, I'm speaking of the illusion that consciousness is the will itself. The concept of a conscious will that is free seems to be incoherent. It suggests that one's will is separate and isolate from the rest of its environment, yet paradoxically able to influence its environment by making choices within it. Many people, however, object on ethical grounds to the assertion that conscious will is an illusion. Holding that people should be held responsible for their choices and behavior, we can still acknowledge the difference between premeditated action and the sort that are caused by mental illness or other disorders of the mind-brain. The brain can be viewed in an analogous way when it's come to conscious will.
Who are we? Well, human beings are aware not only of their surroundings, but also of their own behaviors, bodies, and mental life. They are, in other words, self-conscious. Self-consciousness can be defined as being aware of oneself. However, a self-conscious subject is not just aware of anything that happens to be themselves, as one would be if they saw an old image without realizing it was of themselves. A self-conscious subject, on the other hand, is aware of themselves as themselves. It is obvious to them that they are the object of awareness. Self-consciousness is a type of consciousness that is grammatically articulated in English by the words I, me, and my, which are terms that we all use to refer to ourselves. When we discuss about consciousness, we often refer to ourselves as the topic of everything. We experience everything we are aware of appears to be happening to or around ourselves. We appear to be having a united experience with events in the globe unfolding in a smooth manner. However, as we've seen, binding processes play a role in this, creating the illusion that physical events are perfectly timed with our conscious awareness of them in the current moment.
When we talk about who are we, humans are aware of their surroundings as well as their own behaviors, bodies, and minds. To put in another way, they are self-aware. Being aware of oneself is self-consciousness. A self-conscious subject, on the other hand, is not just aware of anything that happens to be themselves, as one would be if they saw an old image of themselves without realizing it. A self-conscious subject, on the other hand, is aware of themselves as themselves. They are aware that they are the subject of awareness. Second, we talk about split brain, even more outstanding in the fact that each hemisphere's feelings and ideas appear to be private and unknown to the other. A split brain patient himself is perplexed by the other's thoughts and wishes as any other person in the room. It's difficult, if not impossible, to say whether both points of view and split brain patient are conscious, but there's no reason to doubt that each has an experience associated with its thoughts and designs, and most neuroscientists believe that both hemispheres are conscious, because both the speaking and mute hemisphere carry out complex plant behaviors, both hemispheres will have conscious percepts, even though the character and content of their feelings may not be the same, says Allen, Institute for Brain Scientist, neuroscientist Christoph Koch. What is split brain? All direct one-neuron connections between the two forebrain cerebral cortices have been served in a split brain, which is actually the brain of mammal. The corpus callosum is the largest interhemispheric bridge or commissure. As a result, callosal disconnection syndrome is also known as split brain syndrome. It is a condition in which the corpus callosum is partially or completely self-correlation, resulting in a cluster of neurological abnormalities. A surgical procedure called an corpus callosotomy is the most common cause. In this book, the master emissary, which is about the two hemispheres of the brain, scientist Ian Belgitris described his intriguing thesis about the possibility that consciousness originates much deeper in the structures of the brain than scientists typically believe. As a result of the revelation brought to us by split brain research and other advances in modern neuroscience, many people have been led to ask, is there some version of split consciousness that occurs in brains that are physically split? It is possible that there are additional consciousness centers. What we might think of as other minds who are closer to the we realize different centers. Configuration or plus of consciousness coexisting or overlapping is not possible to imagine.
Is there some form of parted awareness that happens in minds that aren't truly parted? Are there different focuses of awareness even? What we could consider different personalities living nearer to us than we suspect. Maybe it's not difficult to envision that unique focuses, setups, or streams of awareness exist in nearness to each other or crossover, even in a solitary human body. However, while the term has been used to portray a wide extent of thinking since the dawn of time, contemporary thoughts of panpsychism give portrayals of reality very surprising from the earlier structures and are unrestricted by any severe convictions.
However, nothing about his statement keeps up with the hypothesis about care. It assists us with grasping the like thought in panpsychism, that maybe care is another property of issue or of the genuine universe that we can find. In his book, Panpsychism in the West, the scholarly David Skrbina gives an example of the real setting of reasonable debates for panpsychism that depends upon reasoning, exact proof, and developmental standard. Skrbina walks the perusers through various hundred of years of contemplation by analysts from Johannes Kepler to Roger Penrose, who takes on a coherent system to panpsychism, huge quantities of whom appear at the end that the simplest explanation of mindfulness is honestly Panpsychism 1.
Despite the lack of meaningful, comprehensive arguments in any of the criticism on panpsychism that I've read, they've been fierce. Panpsychism has been charged of being incoherent and breathtakingly impossible, with proponents associated to religious extremists from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Edwards 1967, to the New York Review of Books. Those of us who want to push this conversation forward have an important obligation to clearly distinguish panpsychic views from the false conclusion people tend to draw from the namely that panpsychism somehow justifies or explains a variety of panpsychic pneumonia, following from the incorrect assumption that consciousness must entail a mind with a single point of view and complex thoughts. Ascribing some level of consciousness to plants or inanimate matter is not the same as ascribing to the human mind, with wishes and intentions like our own. Anyone who believes the universe has a plan for us, or that he can consult with his higher self for medical advice, should not feel propped up by the modern view of panpsychism. It supports nothing of the sort. Bacteria with some minimal level of consciousness streaming through their atoms would still bacteria. They would still lack brains and complex minds, much less human ones. When we believe that a bacterium or an atom has some level of conscious experience, we are obviously not attributing to it qualities of our own experiences, but rather we can imagine a qualitative field that has a character in some very abstract sense similar to our experiences, but especially unimaginable to us and unlike our own experience of consciousness, as philosopher Greg Rosenberg points out. And of course, the false conclusion drawn from a misunderstanding of panpsychism that individuals, atoms, cells, or plants possess an experience comparable to that of a human mind, for instance, are often the weighting used to argue against it.
Stuff that is structured in the way physics reveals. The answer again is that we don't know, except insofar as this stuff takes the form of conscious experience. Once again, it's important to distinguish between consciousness and complex thought when considering modern panpsychic views. Postulating that consciousness is fundamental isn't the same as suggesting that complex ideas or thoughts are fundamental and magically result in a material realization of those ideas. The claim is just the opposite, that if consciousness exists as a fundamental property, complex system built from that which is already streaming, consciousness could eventually give rise to physical structures such as human minds. David Scribina addresses the problem of anthropic projections, in which we place the demands of human consciousness on inanimate particles, and he explains the necessity of distinguishing between consciousness and memory.
Consciousness and time. This last chapter talks about the relationship between our consciousness in the present moment, where we are at the time, whether it truly passed by. The author also used the explanation of Dean Bonamano, using a neuroscientist in his book, Your Brain is a Time Machine, where it explained that whether the flow of time is an illusion or a true sight into nature of reality depends in part of which of these two opposing views in physics turns out to be correct. She also presented the theories presentism, where time is in fact flowing and only present moment is real. And the other one is eternalism, in which we live in a black universe where time is more like space. Just because you are in one occasion or moment doesn't mean the other doesn't truly exist simultaneously.
Conclusion. The author concluded by wondering if we ever unlikely to unfold the mysteries behind our consciousness, but not disregarding the fact that our knowledge and capabilities are still young and that mysteries are everywhere within us.